Welcome back everybody to me talking about Malazan stuff. And today we're going to talk more about Assail by Ian Cameron Esslemont. This is the third video. I wanted to record it yesterday, but then my brain kind of shorted out and I didn't actually finish the video because it was terrible. And then I didn't have time to record a new one, and so forth. Anyway, we're getting close to the halfway point of this last novel, and we're going to talk about chapters 5 and 6 today. So, yeah, there we are. Let's go. Cheers. All right. So, things are continuing to escalate, as they usually do in Malazan novels, right? And that's kind of where we are right now, with everyone. We're going through all those groups for a second and see how that all feels. And we'll start with what's going on the steppes, or whatever you want to call it, the Grasslands, with our good buddy Kyle, because there's a lot of Kyle going on in that book. A lot. And what do I mean by that? Something that I feel is important to understand or important to look at here is the idea of territory. I've said it before that, the Malazan world takes a lot of inspiration from all kinds of places, because there is always that connection to our world, which technically is something that happens with most fantasy books. There's very few uniquely, different and alien fantasy worlds out there. Anyway, this one, because of the Gold Rush theme and some others, has this interesting, I guess the first connection we tend to make is sort of the North Americas and what is technically called the Western, or whatever, that kind of genre in a way. Added to that, obviously, is that idea of the North and Norse mythology and whatnot, something that is kind of used here when it comes to the language, the specific places like Jorgenholm and Jotunfiend, which sounds pseudo-Norse to me. Probably not only to me, but definitely to me. But something that we need to understand here is, I feel, the idea of property and territory, which is sort of not at the heart, but a large part of what's going on in these chapters. So one thing we see is that when Kyle tries to cross the Grasslands, the lands of the Silent People, which is kind of north of his own place, which was the Children of the Wind, or the Wind People, or whatever you want to call them. The idea there is that property has a different meaning in these circumstances. Now, why is that the case? When we think about property, place, ground we own, territory we own, I guess most of us have that idea that it's that's just our private property is stuff that we live on and stuff that we work on, having your private garden and having your house, that kind of stuff, the kind of thing that is influenced by people that read too much John Locke, which is usually people that read John Locke, period. But, and this is, I feel, is important here, we're talking about a different culture. We're talking about a very specific different culture, that is a tribal culture that seem to be hunter-gatherers, something like that, I assume. It's also a rather dry grassland, I assume, so resources are thin on the ground. So people have a much larger territory that they need, plus their territory, the connection of those tribes to their specific territory is bound in to their culture. There's a spiritual connection to those specific places that make crossing the kind of country much more of a problem than, crossing, than people that come from a different background would think it is. What do I mean by that? I mean, technically, I guess we would be kind of fucked up if someone would just walk across our garden because it's a shortcut or whatever. But on the other hand, if we'd see like a huge fucking step, and I'm like, yeah, well, we'll just cross this. Why do people get upset if we do that? Well, once again, there's on the one hand, there's that idea of like there's very scarce resources in that area anyway, so you entering that kind of place is endangering the survival of the tribes that claim those places as their home. But since you also have that spiritual connection to the place in a way, the feeling of violation, so to speak, of invasion, is much stronger than if it were just, a generally, one field on like in like a Western agricultural area, right? Like if I cross like a field, probably the farmer will not be very happy, but I guess the connection is more like an economic one than that spiritual level that is there, that being one with the land. And while that is certainly strong in the in the south there, where Kyle is currently running around, it is even stronger in the north with the in the Salt Range. Is it the Salt Range? I don't know. The land of the Ice Bloods, that area, because there we have those different tribes of like clans, I guess, having their clan lands and defending them. Their ancestors are tied into that land as spirits, making entry into those lands much more, even more of a violation, a spiritual violation. And that explains why they are fighting so hard, even though I guess they don't use those lands. I mean, they do hunt, they do have some farming, I guess. They don't they don't technically need all of that land, but it's their land. They're tied to it on a their identity is tied to that specific area of ground, which once again I feel is like something that a lot of us have kind of lost the connection to in the West. Like, for example, through ideas of like a nation state or a nationhood, right? We define ourselves as German or British or whatever, but that idea is a way more abstract one than just saying this area, which is where I grew up, where my parents and grandparents and great grandparents grew up. This is my ground, and it's just this small area, relatively small area. Having that's like a different way of looking at identity through like a specific ground, basically. That's sort of something that we'll see here a lot more in the next couple of chapters, and it's something that explains why so much of this book is about defending ground, is about defending territory against invasions of all sorts. Now, the other interesting thing is something that we see with Kyle and him meeting Liane, how to pronounce her, and Doran, and being chased by those people, is the idea of the challenge of honor and of ritualized warfare. Now that is obviously something that we see in a lot of like in our historical context. We know about like these ideas of like duels of champions and as ritualized forms of warfare to avoid wholesale slaughter, because technically that's pretty fucking dangerous depending on where you live, because you don't the death of a bunch of like fighters can technically mean the death of the entire tribe, because you don't have enough people to actually do all the necessary stuff together, all the foodstuffs and shit that you might need if you don't live in like extraordinary wealth. So the concept of having champions battling it out and that deciding the outcome of a specific war is one that we know from like our history a lot. Like the idea of like David versus Goliath is kind of that idea, right? You have like the one guy walking up and down is like, yeah, I challenge you, and someone else coming up and knocking him out with a rock, which has its own advantages and disadvantages and other messages in that book, but we're not here to do Bible studies today. Anyway, I feel there's like several things going on there. On the one hand, we see that idea of ritualized warfare and its advantages in specific situations. That is interclan warfare. Why does it work there? Because both sides, or all the sides involved, those tribes, the silent people, the children of the wind, all those people, those clans, abide by the same rules. Now, that will obviously be a problem if outsiders come into that area and they don't abide by those rules. They don't abide by the idea of like having defeated a champion or being defeated by a champion. They don't retreat. They don't like end the conflict, which is once again one of those things that we see happening in the Malazan world again and again. It's like if different backgrounds, different cultures collide, there's definitely always a loser, or someone who is too rigidly tied to a specific way of thinking and acting might just fail. We'll see where that is going again and again and again. The other side of this is obviously that if you have a warrior society that is so much built on honor, honor in combat, for example, that has other disadvantages, as our good buddy Kyle is learning, right? Now, what do I mean by that? It's like Kyle doesn't want to go into those conflicts. He wants to pass through. Now, we've seen why that is probably not possible that easily. But what happens because of, him carrying that specific sword and all of that, suddenly hunting him down, taking him out, killing him in more or less honorable combat becomes part of that honor system within that warrior society of those tribes. Suddenly they don't hunt him down because he's like, pissing in their piece of grassland, but mostly because whoever kills the guy then becomes like the big boss, or like gathers a lot of honor there. And that, is a huge problem because we know that Kyle has like powers on his side that the others don't have. So they'll send like 1, 2, 3, like more and more like warriors that those tribes might actually need in like an actual conflict. They'll send against something as ridiculous as fighting a far superior Kyle, even though that last one is getting really close to killing Kyle. But so we also see the problem that if you have a combat-based, like a warrior society that's built on this a system of honor and ritualized combat and whatnot, it can also like lead to the problem that the only way to solve any conflict is ritualized, more or less ritualized combat to the death, which, yeah, I don't know, maybe sometimes talking things out would be wiser. But if your like rites, your rituals, all of that stuff is tied into that like very like rigid structure of a tribal society, it's fairly difficult to change out of that. That's not a very flexible society that we're talking about here, and we see part of like why that can be a problem. Does that make them like less good or whatever than other forms of society that we meet here? No, of course not. There's a lot of good aspects to that, like a lot of things to be admired. It's just that time doesn't fucking care. So we'll see how that goes. On the other hand, it also shows how all those people being drawn there by the gold rush and not understanding what they're getting into are killed. I mean, it's one of those things that where you have a bit of the whole like Western idea once again. If you have these individual tracks of people crossing the land and not respecting the rules, not even knowing the rules or caring about the rules, are just slaughtered. And it feels super fucking cruel when you look. It's like people being skinned alive and shit like that. That is super fucking cruel. Of course, there's no argument there. But it could probably be avoided if people would actually think about what they're doing and try to learn who they're dealing with. Like, understanding the world you're in is vital. And while that may, from our position now seem cruel, it is also avoidable because, think about what you're doing. Also, don't let yourself be trapped just by gold and the idea of gold. One of those aspects that we're talking about in a second is the idea of rebellion. So we have the idea that Doran is the last heir of some Genebacan city. And they're here to gather gold to raise a rebellion against the Empire. And there were some interesting ideas on like how empires work, and that it's that empires are too big to fight, and you can't actually win against something like that. That you make it just too expensive to continue there and like maybe go somewhere else. If expansion is the drive of an empire, then as a successful strategy is an interesting idea. It's like you look at the Roman empires, like why, like some parts of say Germania and some parts of like the Parthian Empire and whatnot were never like part of the Roman Empire. It's just like it was easier to go somewhere else and conquer somewhere else, right? You don't want to deal with the Picts if you can avoid it. After a while, you just get bored and you build a wall instead and use your military power to go somewhere else. Sort of that kind of idea is sort of in there in that argument that Layan has with Kyle. On the other hand, there's still people trying to hold on to whatever and failing to adapt or go with the times. It's like you need a lot of gold to start a rebellion, but if you have to pay for all of that stuff, you might want to think twice about whether you can actually successfully end that, like lead that rebellion to like a victory, because maybe people are only following just for monetary gain, which is a short-term thing. It's not a long-term thing. Maybe people are kind of mostly happy. If you need to bribe people away from the Malazan Empire, maybe you have a problem that you can't solve with money in the long term. But then again, if you think of yourself as a ruler with God-given, like with divine right monarchy or what have you, it's very difficult once again to back out of that pattern and find a place for yourself in that new organization. Something that's interesting when you look at Mal of Gris, or Mal Gris, whatever you want to call her, in that crew with our buddy Fisher and gang. And she has obviously adapted, and she's, we know that she was like as the rightful ruler of the area of Gris. She is apparently not really just searching for gold to get like start a rebellion against the empire. She seems to have settled with her position within the empire. So we see those two aspects as well, as like letting go and adapting, going with the times, or maybe not. We'll see. We'll see. I'm just like freewheeling it here and rambling, of course. Speaking of Mal of Gris and talking about what's going on with Fisher's crew. So they're walking inside, they're behaving like fucking conquerors and arseholes, going a raiding, doing all the things that raiders do. And I like the fact that Cam Esslemont is very much making, showing how those different groups behave. You have the Letheri that go take a lot and rob a lot, but not too much, because it has to be sort of sustainable. You have to give people enough to survive so you can go and retax them whenever, which is one way of doing it, which is like how the Letheri Empire works. Then you have, on the other hand, Angle's raiders, those pirates who are not there to, come back and rule. They're just like to go there, take whatever, and leave. The Lindisfarne way of taxation, so to speak, which includes a lot of sexual violence, because that's just how raiding used to work. And warfare, technically warfare still works that way, unfortunately, in a lot of cases. But that's sort of like something that we see there. And then you have the Malazan Empire that is very much built on sustainable expansion, and not only like military expansion, like not just the rule of force, right? We've spoken about that before. It's like you go somewhere, you end local corruption, and you make sure that people are better off with you than without you, and that's how you keep your empire in a way. Sure, there will always be people that are unhappy with your rule, but like if the larger populace sees like improvements that you bring, whether it's the Roman Empire, is like, what have the Romans ever done for us, kind of thing, or in this case, the Malazan Empire bringing administration, organization, and stuff that can be trusted. That's how you do the long-term kind of thing. And that's why we see how especially the Malazans and partly the Letheri are trying to prevent the raiders and pirates from going all like Lindisfarne on the entire countryside, which we see those different, like it always depends on your society and your goals, how you treat people in like a military campaign. But I guess like no one is against like wholesale robbery, which is how you keep your people fed. Foraging, as they say. So, what's interesting about that? Like, the other thing that's interesting is obviously the story with the Bone White, the Bone Monster. And there's like, I feel like two aspects there that I want to look at, maybe three. One of them is like that no one is actually trusting those stories. It's like, oh, they're just rumors. The idea that like there's like two options. One of them is that there's a kernel of truth in every story, in every rumor. The other way to look at it is like the one that Jethis, or like Andii, Thais Andii, is saying like maybe they'll just like feed on each other again and again and again, and that's how the story grows and remains. Obviously, we're in a fantasy world, so talk about monsters will probably oftentimes lead to fucking monsters. And so it does this time round. It's a Jotun fiend, which sounds like, or like, that's how the audiobook pronounces it. No idea how it's written, but that sounds very Norse to me. I mean, Jotun are giants in Norse mythology, and the bone monster they find is pretty fucking ginormous, so to speak. Also, this is like one of those ideas that I like about the Malazan world, and especially about Cam Esslemont's side of things, that he tends to sometimes slip into these like very specific mythological modes, right? The idea of having a demon guard a bridge, demanding a toll, oftentimes a toll in blood, or in this case in bones, it feels very like mythology and not just like a fantasy story. It has its own like fantastic twist of the bone monster being created of all these different bones, of all these different beings, possibly beings that crossed that bridge before, tried to cross the bridge before, I mean, most likely. But, you know, it just has that weird, like, sometimes legends are just true kind of thing, a feel to it. Plus, the idea of like an entire bridge made out of bones is just super fucking creepy. I don't know if you guys have ever been to some of those really great ossuaria in Eastern Europe, and like in Europe in general. Sedlec in Czech Republic, in Kutná Hora being one of those, where you have like entire buildings decorated with bones and stuff. That shit's creepy as fuck. But it's not unheard of. So we have that aspect there, which is something that I like. Plus, we have the really interesting conversation with Jethis, the Thais Andii, who does not know his name and anything and so forth, and being promised his name and seeing his death as a worthwhile price to pay to actually get his name back. And there's like basically three reasons in there why that is such a meaningful and powerful thing. I mean, obviously we have like in magical, in fantasy, and in general like magical beliefs, we know that names, true names, have a lot of power. So name a thing and you have power and control over it. On the other hand, so like getting his name back helps him definitely in that regard, but like names are also very much tied to identities, and identity is, and I guess that's something we learned before in Blood and Bone, right? Is the idea that what is the question is like, what is an identity? What is our identity? How do we define the self, and how much of that is knowing your name and all that stuff? So if you don't know your identity, your name, who you are you actually really alive? So is paying with your life and bones for knowing, at least for a while again, who you are, is that really a price that is too high? Good question, right? I mean, in that form of logic. And I feel that's the important aspect of that whole scene, is that it shows that like something that is abhorrent and terrible on a materialistic plane, on like a materialist view, which is like sacrificing one person there, sacrificing your life to, learn something, a piece of knowledge. Is that not too high a price? If you add that other level, it's like for actually being able to become yourself again. Is there anything that is too high a price for being yourself? I don't think so. So we see that. Now, obviously, there's other aspects there. There is the Letheria with their purely utilitarian ethics of like, well, it's a high price, but paying that price might still be worth it. Kind of, yeah, fuck those people. Like, I'm not exactly a fan of utilitarian ethics. I'm just saying. It's one of those things that we see there going on. Plus the idea of like the Malazan character, so to speak, which is to try and fight against, because it is wrong to do a deal, which is sort of the Malazan way of doing it. Plus, you have the raiders who are just like super undisciplined, but also understand about, the emotional value, right? You have that, you have that idea when Angolf is just like actually like crying. It's like, man, dude. He's very thankful in that situations. So it's a very powerful scene, and then being betrayed by the monster. Well, it gives us the "it's broken my neck" joke, which is really cool, and it gives us Coots and Badlands, and that's really fun. Because for the first time we get like an actual description of Coots and Badlands. I always thought they were taller when you read about them in Return of the Crimson Guard, but then again we also learned that Kyle is rather short. So maybe that's just like another thing. Anyway, what I liked about it is like how they show up and recognize Fisher, and Fisher's like, oh god, it's not those two again. So I like that. Having that like sense of like humor in there once again, even in those dark scenes, is something that Cam Asselmont is really good at. I feel like the more macabre kind of humor. I like that. So there's that. What else should we talk about before we end this for tonight? Obviously, we need to talk about Shimmer and the Crimson Guard. I'm mostly about Shimmer and bars tonight. Apart from like the really dumb joke of like, now I know why they call you Iron Bars, which, well, I'm sorry, I'm a kid in my mind. I like that joke. Anyway, the more important aspect here is once again one of those like deep Malazan beliefs that are part of the Malazan universe, like that emotions, that the heart is important. Now remember we had that discussion of like whether the in Blood and Bone, whether it's our will and our intelligence or like intellect ruling, being the thing that drives life or defines life and existence, or whether it's the heart. And the idea is obviously that going the absolute that we went in Blood and Bone, both sides, is wrong. But emotions are what make us human. That feeling and passion are important. So when Shimmer does the whole thing with bars, on the one hand, there's like the idea that like just like giving yourself room to feel, even allowing the pain that may come and follow and so forth, is what makes you human in a way. It also shows us a lot about like how Cam Asselmont understands human interactions and relationships. Now, I'm obviously not a good guy for relationship advice, but I feel bars, like the description of bars, like what bars tells Shimmer about how men can be frightening women can be frightening to men. Because they can break us, and the idea of like not actually going out and talking to a woman or trying to actually flirt or whatever, which is what bars never did. It's exemplary for like a specific type of man. I mean, a specific type of person in general. Now, in a more still not fully, gender equal society, which obviously the Malazan world still not is, even though we're looking at gender equality in a lot of stuff in the Malazan world, right? We have like more or less, well, we don't have gender parity, but we have a lot of like, classic gender roles are mostly abandoned. But apparently here, when it comes to sexuality and relationships, there's still that idea of men trying to, be more forward or more active when it comes to courtship and all these things. Which is why Shimmer taking the initiative there is obviously an argument with that, but we see that bars in a way is rather conservative when it comes to that. It's like they're like standing still and maybe the wild animal will come to you. Like, I know people who are like that, who suck at flirting or like getting to know anyone because they are just rather shy or don't want to put themselves forward, and being afraid of like your preferred gender when it comes to dating or whatever. I feel it explains, and this is sort of where I'm going with this, right? It's like, this is not how men should be. This is not. That's not the point. The point, however, is that because of how our society work, how our like general education when it comes to or to relationships and whatnot works, there is a large, not a large, but a significant part, like a significant number of men out there that actually are rather close in personality, if not in physical attributes, to our good buddy Iron Bars. The other side, however, on that, which I feel is important with Iron Bars, is that Iron Bars is always described as someone who is very, very much allowing his passions, his emotions to. He's very open about that, right? He's very open about when it comes to like his rage, his passion, his love, his pain, all of that stuff. He's not denying any of that, which I guess is an important aspect, because when we look at what is going on with the Crimson Guard and other aspects of the Malazan world, our good buddies, the Clan Imass, for example, right? They lose their emotions, and with their emotions, they lose their humanity. The Clan Imass have lost it. Ka'az says he doesn't feel any passions at all anymore, and he's becoming more and more like death-like, I guess. So, giving ourselves the room to be vulnerable, giving ourselves the room to show and share and have and feel emotions is an important aspect of what makes us human, apart from just like human beings, right? Like, intellect is important, but like what makes us fully human is giving our heart, giving our emotions room to exist. And that's sort of something that we see here. And I do appreciate all of that. I think it's really good. Just saying. So what else is interesting? We see the end of the ship horror with learning that there is an actual curse on the Sea of Dread. They get through once the primogenitrix of, I have forgotten where, unveils her power, because she's apparently hiding from something. What? We don't know yet. But there's an important aspect there once again. It's like with the priest, her guardian was being concerned only with her, and her concern being the welfare of everyone else. And in that we see another echo of like how organized religion oftentimes work, how the church oftentimes work, like, because on paper, it by definition, the like when we look at the Christian church right now, right, the job of the priest is to care for the people. That's kind of what, when you look back at the Christian idea, right, is to die for the people, to sacrifice yourself for the welfare of all of humanity. That's sort of what Jesus does, if you believe that stuff. And the Pope, as his representative on earth, is kind of in a sort of similar, well, not the full-on sacrifice, but that kind of position. But organized religion usually builds around itself a structure to make sure that whole religion, that church, can exist. And at that point, you also have the impulse of self-preservation, which is why you have the whole hierarchy of the church and doing all this dumb shit that they're doing right now as well. It's like self-protection of the organization as such is very, very powerful and can be a problem, or can be, counterproductive to the original mission statement of your organization. And we kind of see that going on there with the primogenitrix actually realizing or deciding at some point that she has to act now, even though there might be some danger to her, because that's her function. She would actually, betray her like role, her function, whatever you want to call it, her vocation, her identity if she would not act and help everyone else to actually get through that trap that they're technically in. So that's just like a quick like thing around that that I found interesting. We'll see where all of that is going with that ship crew. We have a bit of like, we have the end of that whole meeting with Sea Strike, of that horror story we spoke about last time, which is pretty cool. And now let's have a quick look at the Ice Bloods, right? Everyone is training there. It's all fun and games. It feels good. But there is a dark meaning, or like a more like harsh or brutal thing below that. I feel that. So there's like two things here that I want to talk about in a second, and then I guess we're basically done for today. Number one. So the life of Ormond and the others up there is described as fairly idyllic, right? They're fighting, well, not fighting so far, mostly they're like training, running around, the weather is nice, food's great, everything is like a bit romantic. It feels like a Boy Scout camp most of the time. And then danger comes, like protecting the place, and then we realize that there is a darker, harsher thing underneath that. And that is, the idea that while we tend to romanticize a primitive lifestyle oftentimes, we romanticize living in nature, living with nature, living more traditionally, all of that stuff. There's a large part of our world, especially when it comes to like the more conservative side of things, where we tend to romanticize that stuff. But that shit's pretty fucking harsh. Those societies have pretty fucking harsh rules that oftentimes end pretty fucking deadly. Case in point here, the story of Jazz, right? So he doesn't actually kill someone, or in that battle that we'll talk about in a second. So his uncle, I guess, clan elder, sends him out on his own to go and kill someone in defense of the hold, to actually, prove that he's worthy of being a man or being whatever. And that's pretty fucking dark, and in the long run, very, very harmful, because, that's not how you actually keep your group of people healthy, wealthy, and alive. And we see, we do see that this is a classic story. Like, he gets, sort of humiliated, so he goes and does something really stupid, which I guess we kind of know. He's going towards the Bane Holdings to do something dumb there. And Ormond is following him. And we already met Lotchie Bane, right? So I guess we can predict what's coming next. But yeah, sucks. So we see how adhering to strict, rather physical rules or codes of honor has a lot of dark downsides. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying there should be no morals or whatever, no codes of behavior in our lives. That's not what the point, but it pays to re-examine them from time to time and look at whether they are still actually beneficial for us as a species, as a society, or whatever. Doesn't happen here. We'll see where it's going. The other thing that I wanted to look at is the threat, the organized stuff. Now, we know we've spoken about the Western connection and all of that stuff, right? So you have the idea of individual people, disorganized settlers, prospectors, or whatever, intruding into tribal lands and being repulsed and slaughtered. And that's something that has happened, obviously. But the other thing that happened at some point is that those people get military support, organized military support, which is what we see beginning here. We have that group of mercenaries coming up, and they put up a much harder fight than you might expect, because they are technologically and strategically advanced, more advanced than 5 dudes that do, spear fighting gymnastics up in the mountains every summer, sort of, right? And the sad truth that mercenary, even though he's dying, tells to Ormond is you're a straw hut in a storm. It's yeah, you'll probably be overrun, and history bears this out. So looking too much on once again, we come to that whole idea of sticking too much to traditions, not being willing or able to change, is a problem. The other side of this is, however, is like, what could the Ice Bloods do without just giving up their entire identity and existence to survive there? It's a question that we have. It's it's the thing that we've spoke about before as well. There is that tragedy in it, that responsibility that the more technologically advanced groups of people, ideally, if you have enough awareness and all the other good things have, is if you think that a way of life has value on its own, traditions have value. If you accept that on a global level, then you need to make sure that you don't destroy those things, or find ways for everyone to survive, which is obviously not what's happening here, because we're talking about fucking capitalism and greed, and people's like, yeah, let's just take that place. We are still definitely on the side of like the strong survive and the rest gets fucked. And that's sad, but we'll see how all of that continues in the next chapters, which I'll hopefully talk about tomorrow. Then I'll figure out what I'll do over Christmas, and we'll finish all of that stuff next week, and thus before the end of the year. So until then, have a great Wednesday, and I'll talk to you later. And until then, cheers.